For the second reading of this bill, we are in a unique situation. This is because the principal issue that arises for consideration in this bill, that is the GST hike, has already been discussed not just during this year's annual budget debate, but in the speeches made since 2018, after the government's decision to increase GST was announced. This long foreshadowing has already led to the Workers' Party deciding to vote against the GST increase. Voting, however, is a blunt knife. It doesn't cut well because there are, in fact, points of consensus between honourable members of the PAP and WP on several important things. As stated by my parliamentary colleague, Mr. Liang Eng Wah, broadly, both parties agreed to higher levels of social spending for the future and acknowledge the need to raise revenue to meet the expenditure, especially against the spectre of an economy that's likely to grow more slowly. Where we come apart clearly is whether GST should and can be a source of revenue. Globally, such value-added taxes have been used at higher rates than Singapore, Sweden 25%, UK 20%, and Japan at 10%. Mr. Speaker, sir, no political party in this House has a monopoly on care and concern for the welfare of Singaporeans, especially the low and middle income groups, the sandwich class, the elderly who need heavily subsidized healthcare, as well as the young Singaporeans who need to see a future and opportunities in Singapore. But how to get there? That's the nut. And in this, we are appearing to be arguing from exact opposite sides of each other. So how is it that two parties, which are aligned on all the main objectives, can be so far apart in the assessment of whether or not a GST hike is the proper thing to do for our people? Let me try and answer this by offering a historical perspective. In 1993, the GST bill was introduced in this House. Then, as now, it was an unpopular move. Then, as now, there were good reasons to do so. We needed to strengthen our tax base to ensure that our tax structure was resilient and promote enterprise and growth. In 1993, direct taxes made up about 60% of our tax revenue, of which 73% was income and corporate tax. Introducing a consumption tax would keep Singapore competitive and also allow us a stable and diversified stream of tax revenues and allow us to invest more heavily in growth. The WP raised strenuous objections to its passing. The Honourable MP then, Mr. Loh, in his speech, felt that there was no basis to suggest that high income and corporate taxes had the effect of driving talent and entrepreneurism away. He was concerned about the regressive nature of the tax, especially on low-income people. The PAP's response was to recognize the possible shortcomings and work in policy fixes, such as GST offsets for low-income households. The GST was introduced on the 1st of April 1994, and what happened thereafter? Historically, the rate of corporate and personal income tax were at 40% before 1985. This came down to 33% after the recession in 1985. After the GST was enacted, it came down further to 28%. Now it's up to 24% for personal income tax and 17% for corporate tax. In fact, majority of Singaporeans don't pay income tax. In the meantime, our government grew our economy by leaps and bounds. We attracted investments and talent. We had government transfers to our people. Median salaries increased. In other words, whatever the honourable ministers then, Dr. Richard Hu and Mr. Dhanabalan, said on behalf of the government on that occasion in 1993 would happen, happened. Our tax rates went down. Our tax revenues did not. Our social spending went up, benefiting the poorest amongst us the most. The doomsday prediction that the poor and the lower income people will be left behind did not materialize. On the issue of timing, it should be borne in mind that in 1993, there was strong economic growth and budgetary surpluses. It could have been argued that there was no pressing need to pass the GST Act. But when you cast your eyes into the long term, your perspective changes. In 1993, when our economy was strong and our people were young, it was already felt that GST was needed for the long term. Today, when we are older and the economy is struggling, it turns out that our 1993 decision was correct. I then fast forward to 2003. Those were tough times, more like 2022. Then we were recovering from the Asian financial crisis of 1997 and the recession in 2001. We also had SARS. Our fiscal situation was very tight. The Singapore economy was struggling. Revenue needs to be increased to fund expenses. The government decided to stagger the GST increase much like this time, 1% in 2003 and 1% in 2004. Then, like now, some voices had suggested to defer, but that will heighten the risk of leaving the government with insufficient funds for healthcare, education, and defense. Singapore would then be in a structural deficit. In a small, open economy, this would have had serious consequences for our exchange rate, for the stability of the Singapore dollar. If we continually run a deficit, the Sing dollar would go down, inflation up, and everything in Singapore, including our CPF savings, would be worthless. Therefore, we decided to do the difficult thing and proceed. Again, the WP was against it. Mr. Loh argued for the increase of the net investment income, NII ceiling, not unlike what WP is asking for now. He also suggested increase in property tax and sin tax too. He was again concerned about the impact of GST on inflation. DPM Lee, as he then was, explained why we were unable to avoid a GST hike, much like how DPM Wong explained during the budget debate this year. What happened after that? In 2002, we dreamt big. The budget, which included raising of the GST, also contained the new thinking of the Economic Review Committee, ERC, which brought about fundamental changes to our economic policies. It aimed to develop a vibrant sector driven by entrepreneurial energies, fueled by regional and global competition, all seeking the best returns for their ideas. It aimed to attract more global talent, even as we improved and nurtured our own people. It wanted to make our economy more resilient, dynamic, through investing in human capital. But one thing remained, the same as in 1993. The government saw its role as creating a pro-business, stable environment for the market to operate. Part of this requires the implementation of sound fiscal and monetary policies. As a result of the GST hike, we kept fiscal discipline, turned in positive economic growth, and improved the livelihoods of Singaporeans. I now come to 2007. That year, DPM Tharman, as he then was, announced the GST hike to 7%. At that point, there too were questions about the need to reduce direct taxes. The landscape was even more competitive. Everyone was waiting to grab our lunch. Taxes then had to be reduced. He announced the decision to tweak the NII, which was something Mr. Loh advocated, to what it is today. Mr. Loh and Ms. Sylvia Lim argued against the GST hike and suggested that instead that the government use even more NII, get revenue from land sales, corporate tax, stamp duties, and so on, much like what is being sought today. S.M. Tharman demurred. He pointed out that it's dangerous to rely on sentiment-driven transactions for budget purposes. And he said, and I quote, "We have no idea whether these improvements will be sustainable, and it would be very poor fiscal policy to commit to future expenditure in the hope that short-term spikes in revenue will be sustained," unquote. Exactly as what DPM Lawrence Wong said this year. When Mr. Loh and Ms. Lim suggested that GST should only be considered after we have run out of revenue streams, S.M. Tharman stated, and I quote, "This is not the way a responsible government conducts its fiscal policies," unquote. As Honourable Member Ms. Jessica Tan just said, it's dangerous for the government to start scrambling to plug revenue gaps when there's an urgent need to do so. So what has happened since 2007? We had a recession in 2008 due to the global financial crisis. Core inflation at its highest was 6.5%. But we powered through with the GST hike and helped Singaporeans affected by inflation. We focus on creating a more inclusive Singapore with heavy investments in our people, especially the vulnerable, with programs such as Uplift, Kickstart, Workfare, Silver Support Schemes, and so on. We recovered from the recession quickly. In 2012, the GST voucher scheme was made permanent. This hardwired the GST to a larger redistributive regime and is fair and progressive. Today, our economic landscape has been transformed through ITMs. We achieved a remarkable rise in GDP per capita with a larger private sector and a high-value workforce. But more importantly, quoting S.M. Tharman, in his speech delivered on the 14th of August 2015 to the Economic Society of Singapore, he said, and I quote, "We achieved broad-based social upliftment, jobs for all, rising incomes for all, homes for all, quality schools and public health care for all, and neighborhoods and parks shared by all," unquote. It is not my intention to create a rosy picture of the past. The government is not perfect, but by and large, the doomsday predictions of the poor becoming poorer owing to GST hikes simply did not happen. Returning to 2022 actually set against the historical context. There's nothing significantly new in what the WP had suggested for this House consideration. This leads me to a para in the Hammer article co-written by the honourable members Professor James Lim and Mr. Leon Pereira, entitled "Why the GST Hike is Not Necessary," that was published on the 1st of July 2022. They said, and I quote, "Political courage means recognizing that the facts and assumptions that supported an earlier decision have changed. Political courage means being able to recognize that contrary arguments have merit, even though those arguments come from one's political opponents. Political courage means not opposing for the sake of opposing," unquote. I have no trouble with the statements, but surely this applies both ways. History reveals that WP has always been taking a conscientious objection to GST, regardless of the effects it has brought about. Now, Associate Professor James Lim quoted about the Japanese experience of over 25 years to justify his proposition that GST will lead to runaway inflation. I thought it was noteworthy that he did not analyze the Singapore experience instead. Rhetoric for effect seldom helps. Political courage commands a price, but mere talk of political courage is cheap. I now come to the crux of my decision. Objectively, what has happened in history favored the PAP. What we are doing now, as a matter of approach, is no different. It's not just theory, it's almost 30 years of practice. It is clear to me that we will continue to have fiscal pressures. We will deal with it, failing which we will have to deal with it, failing which we will pay a serious price. We also need to get the balance right so as not to affect our attraction as a hub for talent and investments. We just increased our personal income tax, property tax, and vehicle tax. To be fair, this was something that the Workers' Party had broadly advocated for. To further increase these tax bases would upset this balance. I therefore support the increase in GST with the features and schemes addressed to help the less well-off. I also support the judgment call at this point not to deplete income from reserves through land sales and increasing the NIRC ceiling. It is asked, how much is enough when it comes to our reserves? No one knows, and I join Mr. Sito in expressing his view on the same matter. I mean, I remember this question came up in the last session of Parliament, and I ventured to suggest, think of the Indian Ocean tsunami. Nobody expected it to happen, but it happened, and we had to deal with it. There could be a collapse of an Antarctica ice shelf, and we have to deal with the ramifications of it. We may have to accelerate the polar construction. All this costs money. The point is, no one knows. And if somebody says he knows, he's probably a snake oil salesman. So the NRIC 50-50 ratio is equitable because it balances current needs with future needs, putting it on an equal platform. Tilting it in favor of current needs, and I think, is selling our children too short. In building the Singapore of today, our founding fathers carried us on their shoulders. Through sheer grit and determination, they persevered even though at times their knees were buckling and they could have easily given up. We should do the same thing for our children. That is not to say current needs are unimportant. The government is on record to say that no one will be left behind. For cost of living issues alone, $3.5 billion have been allocated for Singaporeans. This twin approach must carry on at the same time. Fiscal responsibility with inclusivity. To argue that the government should sequence its actions is to ignore the reality. The government has to just develop the tentacles to deal with all the multiple existential issues happening at the same time, to steer our country out of stormy waters. We have no choice. For this reason, I support the bill. Mr. Speaker, sir, I asked how is it that the PAP and the WP, which are aligned on many points relating to the need for tax revenues, can be so far apart in assessment of whether or not a GST hike is the proper thing to do for our people. The answer lies partly in political principle and partly in a difference of political judgment. On political principle, we part ways on many counts. But just on the point of political courage, the WP sees it as courageous for PAP to accept good ideas from the Workers' Party. The PAP does not. We see this as good sense. The PAP has pledged to do our best for Singaporeans. And being in a small country, we must not care about the pedigree of ideas, merely about its quality. The Hansard is replete with illustrations where suggestions made across the aisle were accepted by the government. One vivid example is WP's call to level the playing field for accused persons in 2020, which led to the passing of the Public Defenders Act this year. On the other hand, what we see as true political courage in the context of a GST hike, the WP dismisses as being unnecessary or bad timing. We are not so naive to think that the GST will gain us political favor. We know it will be a tough pill, but yet we still ask this of the Singapore people. We ask this because there are hard, immovable economic and fiscal realities in public life that can be either sugar-coated beyond recognition or presented in their true form. The PAP's choice from 1993 to 2022 was always been the latter. We do so as a matter of principle and also because our deep abiding faith in the Singapore people to understand the need for these hard choices and why we have to make them. This is not mere theoretical conviction, but a judgment call, born out of years of experience running the government and understanding the global marketplace. We ask this at a difficult time because we truly believe that it will give us a fairer and more progressive way of financing our government and building a stronger foundation for our nation. That is political courage.